What's up, everyone? Welcome to Let's Talk Markets with Dave Lauer. I am your co-host, Pink, and today we are kicking off an ongoing series of AMAs with industry experts, driven by questions provided by the greater Urvin community. And a lot of these were gathered also on the platform, so if you're not there yet, be sure that you join the community at the terminal.urvin.finance. We do have a wait list currently because we're currently still in beta, but that wait list has no wait. We are so close. But we're getting that wait list turned around in almost no time. So not much of a wait there on the wait list, and we can get you signed right up to join the conversation and make sure that you get to submit questions for the next one, and stay tuned for that announcement. So thank you to the greater Urvin community for providing these questions for our expert today. We are welcoming John Welborn, who is a senior lecturer at Dartmouth College in economics and mathematics. He provides expert consulting and analysis on matters related to short selling, options trading, and trade settlement. John's research has been published in the Journal of Empirical Finance and the Journal of Financial Markets and Regulation. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So since the topic of today's AMA is FTDs and Reg SHO, before we dive in and do a deep dive, I wanted to ask you guys to just give us a quick definition of what you mean when you say FTDs and Reg SHO.
Sure. The stock settlement system that we have today, which has evolved through decades, values liquidity over almost everything else, meaning the system is designed to keep going. No roadblocks, no stumbling blocks. They want people to keep trading. So the system allows for, call it clerical errors. There is a time delay between when a trade is executed, and then there's another part of that trade called clearance, like you're clearing to land the plane, and then settlement is the landing of the plane. Well, the system is designed to keep going, to keep landing planes, even if some of the planes don't actually land, to get where they need to go. And that all is managed through this thing called the continuous net settlement system, or CNS. So a fail to deliver can occur when stock does not arrive at the clearing corporation to close out a trade in time for settlement. It used to be 5 days, then it was 3 days, now it's 2 days. So if stock does not arrive, something called an FTD is noted, a fail to deliver, on the records of this CNS system.
And so, yeah, just so everyone understands, for every trade, there's a buyer and a seller. And if I'm buying shares from you, we can agree to that at one point in time. And then you actually got to give me the shares when I give you the money. But sometimes I give the money and my broker says I've got shares, but I didn't actually get them. Right, that's the failure to deliver.
And what's interesting about the system, to piggyback on what Dave is saying, what's interesting about it is money never fails to deliver. The money always changes hands, right? It's the shares that sometimes don't get where they need to go. But you would think that the counterparties to that process would get upset about it, but most people have no idea. Because of the structure of CNS, the system keeps clicking along, and the buyer of those shares, or the person to whom they are owed, rarely has any idea that there's been a fail to deliver. The system is designed really to make it very hard to know if that's happened.
Yeah, one thing that we also note is that not only is it unclear that, so there is some level of disclosure of FTDs. There's public disclosure. It's published by the SEC. And not only is it not clear that tells the whole picture, right, which we'll get into in a bit, but it's never clear how those FTDs are remediated. How is the problem solved? And that's another thing we're going to talk about today.
Right.
Now, all of this happens within the sort of umbrella of what's called Reg SHO, which is the regulation adopted, I believe, in 2005 to govern short selling in markets. But obviously, there have been rules around short selling for long before that, and Reg SHO itself has been updated over time as well, especially in response to the great financial crisis and the naked short selling problems that exposed. So, John, can you sort of take us through a little bit of Reg SHO history and
Sure,
where it's at today?
Absolutely. So Reg SHO is the kind of a rule that you wouldn't think would be necessary in modern markets. I remember trying to explain this to my parents years ago, and they just couldn't get around the fact that you could have a fail to deliver, that someone could owe stock and not have to deliver that. That was a very strange concept. And it is an anachronism from the 1970s that we live with that.
A lot of people seem to have trouble understanding.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, the number one question I got for this, just to preface it, is why is this even a thing? Why do FTDs
Why is this
even
even
exist?
No,
Yeah.
And what's also so infuriating is if you when real people, I say real people are people for whom that's an obvious question. When they ask regulators about that, regulators love to gaslight them and say it's obvious why we need that.
Yeah.
And so they love talking down to retail investors and pretending that they're ignorant for asking an obvious question like, why would you allow unlimited short positions at the clearing corporation, i.e. FTDs? So Reg SHO is fascinating. It's something you wouldn't think that you need, but you needed it because the system was designed so badly. We're dealing with a legacy technology from the 1970s in the form of central clearing, net clearing, that does not prevent fails to deliver. Reg SHO was born of the dot-com bust. The first big short, before we had 2008, the first big short was Enron. So 2000, 2001 was the dot-com mania. I was in college. You were in college, Dave.
Yep.
Everybody was getting involved in retail trading. E-Trade was big.
I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I was a really good trader because I just bought stuff.
Like Robinhood investors today selling puts on high vol stocks, right? We all thought we knew what we were doing and we got burned with the steamroller. So the bubble bursts. The bubble bursts, and Enron was the most famous bursting of the bubble, because Enron had a lot of retail investors long. And when those people lost their life savings and other stocks as well, it's very common to blame short sellers. And often Wall Street says, oh, you're just blaming short sellers for your bad investment decisions. But there was something curious about Enron. Enron, there was clear fraud. There were accounting irregularities. Enron's the reason we have Sarbanes-Oxley, for good reason. Having independent directors is a great thing to have. But Enron wasn't worth zero. It had some positive value. They had hard assets. They had derivatives contracts that weren't worth zero. And it was pretty obvious that there had been essentially unlimited short selling that never got resolved because it was driven down to pennies, and it all came out in the laundry, so to speak. So even the regulators realized, and I have to take a step back, the system, as I said earlier, is designed to value liquidity. The problem is there's no mechanism to prevent huge, unlimited, what they called short positions at the clearing corporation, which is an anachronistic way of saying FTDs, a fail to deliver. In 1986, Irv Pollock, who was a former SEC commissioner, wrote a very famous report talking about short selling on the NASDAQ. He was commissioned by the NASDAQ. Short selling was not a big thing then, but ironically, this was before 87, which is his timing was pretty prescient. But Irv said there's no mechanism to prevent people from just selling unlimited stuff that they don't have and never delivering it.
Now imagine like that simple statement in the real world. Like we talk about real people, right? Like imagine that in the real world. Like I'm going to take my car and I'm going to sell it to you and give you a title to it, and sell it to him and give him a title to it. Like that would be
exactly
prosecuted as a pretty standard case of fraud.
And it was, and he had the courage to say it. And what was interesting, so he says that in 86. Then 5 years later, something big happened. 6 years later, Prime Brokerage is born. Bear Stearns writes a letter to the SEC, and they say, hey, we have this special class of client, high net worth individuals who want to invest in these things called hedge funds. We want to offer those hedge funds a special type of brokerage service, which we're going to call prime brokerage. And the SEC, true to form, the way it works at the SEC, unlike the real world, at the SEC, you have to get their permission to do things. And if they don't say, yes, you can do that, they say, oh, we will take no action if you do that. So very famously, the Bear Stearns no action letter is received and the world of prime brokerage is born. And prime brokerage, as you know, Dave, goes on to become one of the most valuable parts of the sell side world, of the banking world, is providing services to hedge funds, particularly assisting with their locate and borrow requirements for executing short sales.
Right.
So 10 years later, the market implodes, and it's pretty obvious that short selling, unlimited, unfettered short selling, meaning selling short without borrowing shares, a short sale.
Let's take a second. You said locating and borrowing. So real quick, let's just define those terms for people.
Sure.
So when you go to sell something short, you have to now, didn't have to then, but you have to now locate shares that you are going to borrow, right? When you're selling something short, you're borrowing shares from someone, selling those shares to someone else. And so to complete that sale, you have to deliver those borrowed shares. And so to locate them means I know where I'm going to get those shares. And then to borrow them means I'm actually going to take the loan from this person, give it on to this person, and pay the interest rate that I owe to the person I'm borrowing it from.
And I have to comment on that. So as your viewers know, a short sell is a bet that a stock will go down. The idea is that you sell high, buy low to cover your short position. When you're selling, you're borrowing what you don't have first. You would think that you would actually have to borrow those shares first, that there would be a pre-borrow requirement. But no, if you mention that to the regulators, they act like you're some sort of Luddite who wants to interfere with liquidity and wants wider spreads. So no, when Reg SHO was being debated, they talked about all of these things. Mm-hmm. So it was obvious we had to fix the system. And I actually highly recommend for those interested to go read the SEC comment letters. One of the great things about our country is we have the Administrative Procedure Act requires public comment, period, and back and forth through the regulators and the commenters. So there's a very transparent process, you hope, but you can read all the drafts of Reg SHO. And of course, where it began is not where it ended. Okay. It began with pre-borrow requirements. It began with penalties for failing to deliver for excessive periods of time. It did not have generous. It did not have generous loopholes that the final drafts did. And one of the funniest things is if you go back and read the comment letters, there was one shop, market making shop, who fought hard for something called the options market maker exception. They were the most vocal proponent of an exception to locate and delivery requirements for market makers for the purposes of bona fide market making. That firm ended up being sanctioned quite heavily for abusing that exception, engaging in basically fraudulent behavior. So Reg SHO for short sales, the purpose of Reg SHO was to create some sort of accountability in the system. The end result of it, sadly, was Toothless. Mm-hmm. And I know that because years later, when I was in the presence of some SEC enforcement attorneys in the New York office, they said to me, the rules as written are virtually unenforceable. There's very little we can do with the way the rules are written. And it was a really dispiriting moment for me. I was young, I was idealistic, and to have this SEC attorney said to me, hey, this is how the rules have been written. Yeah. We're given this set of tools. There's only so much we can do with this set of tools.
Yeah. I had an identical experience with a different regulation with someone at FINRA talking about enforcing best execution. And he said almost the exact same thing. And I'll give him this, it was a bit more colorful language. He said, trying to enforce best execution is like trying to staple Jell-O to a wall.
There you go.
Right? Unenforceable. But that's what he's saying. It's unenforceable. Right. So what we see often is we see drafts of regulations when they're first proposed that are compelling, that are worthwhile, and that would solve a problem. And then often what we tend to see is the industry and their industry advocacy groups get in and they pour resources into neutering rules and putting loopholes in there. and then the final product is the sausage, and it's rotten.
Right. And that's and in economics terms, we call this capture. Capture theory famously was really coined by George Stigler in the 70s. Actually, what's funny, in George Stigler's original paper, 1971, about capture, he talks about NASDAQ rules being written for the benefit of the industry. People often forget that part of Stigler's paper, but he won a Nobel Prize for talking about capture theory, among other things. And Reg SHO is a perfect example. It sometimes captures an explicit, sometimes it's implicit. Just regulators spend all their time with their buddies in industry, and they think like them. You might call that cognitive capture. But Reg SHO was written for the benefit of SIFMA, SIA at the time, the Securities Industry Association, now SIFMA. Reg SHO was written for the benefit of SIFMA, not for retail clients.
Yeah, and so another funny story there, at the SEC very recently, talking with an SEC staffer, and he basically said, you guys got to be here more because SIFMA might as well have a satellite office at the SEC.
Oh yeah, no. Every meeting I ever went into the SEC or on Capitol Hill, I would leave, and SIFMA's lead attorney was sitting there outside the office. I won't say his name, but he was in every meeting, following me, preceding me, going and saying, these people are crazy. This is how the world really works.
Yeah.
And the reason we knew Reg SHO was a failure, because immediately, Reg SHO has to be one of the funniest rules in history. It calls for a list, the threshold list of stocks to be published every day of firms that they meet two standards. One, 0.5% of shares outstanding, and 5 days or more at the clearing corporation. So you have to have fails above 0.5% shares outstanding for 5 days at the clearing corporation. Then you go on the Reg SHO threshold list. Well, Reg SHO is debated in 03-04. It's enacted January 3rd, 2005. The gun shoots and the horses start racing. And suddenly there are hundreds of companies on this list. And these are people that had never heard of, they had no idea what was going on. Why are we on this list? And they never came off of it for 3 years. So what Reg SHO became, I used to work with someone who said, it's like a list of liquor stores being robbed. It's not a list of who's robbing liquor stores. It's not a list of the extent to which they're being robbed. It's just a list of liquor stores being robbed. You might as well say, hey, go rob those liquor stores. Right. And so and then you'd go into meetings at the SEC. And I was working with a company at the time that had been on the threshold list for hundreds of consecutive trading days, hundreds. And some deputy director at the SEC, I won't name names, said, well, we don't regulate for the corner cases, meaning that is such an extreme example. Our rules can't help you. And man, I was never more low than after that meeting, because I thought, these are the people that are supposed to be helping issuers, helping retail investors, and they're doing the very opposite.
Right. Let's talk about the threshold list for a second. Because you brought it up just now, and I think what you're saying is between 05 and 08, all of these companies were on it and not getting off. And that the point of the threshold list is that it puts restrictions on what can be done in order to get the stock off the threshold list. Is that right?
It's supposed to. So let's break it down a little bit. There were some exceptions built into Reg SHO to placate, to a certain extent, you can see why these things evolve in a reasonable dialogue among lawyers in Washington, D.C. I spent 10 years in Washington. I got my PhD at George Mason, and I actually teach a class now on regulation. That's how the sausage gets made. I tell my students the first day, this is a class on how the sausage gets made. So I can see how Reg SHO got made from the perspective of a bunch of lawyers sitting around saying, okay, what can we justify? Mm-hmm. So there was the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause famously said, okay, all the fail positions up to, boom, 2005, we can't address those because that was a different rule regime. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to force those to be closed out. We may revisit that later, but for now, we're not going to take any action on that. The second one was the big loophole, the options market maker exception. Mm-hmm. And that is the loophole they drove the truck through. And later on, they admitted all kinds of fraud and shenanigans happened. Many bunch of different firms disgorged millions back to the SEC of profits they made by fraudulently, essentially renting their exception to prevent closeout. So the question becomes, how can firms remain on the threshold list? It does require, if you're on the threshold list, even now, you can no longer merely locate shares. Reg SHO famously did not require a pre-borrow to execute a short sale. It did not even require that you locate shares. It had a reasonable belief standard,
right?
Reasonable belief that you could locate shares prior to settlement. Now, that is written because so much shorting is intraday. So much things happen intraday. You're in, you're out, you're making markets, you're long, you're short. And having the stock loan market is so opaque that it was the argument was, hey, if we have to slow down our process of market making or whatever it is we're doing to go find shares, that's going to be a tax on trading, and it will reduce liquidity, widen spreads, investors will be hurt. So they built, that's kind of the three things. You had the grandfather clause, the options market maker exception, and this nebulous locate requirement. And then finally, this is, if you call that G, O, and L, the D of G.O.L.D was the fact that there was no disclosure of who was failing to deliver. It was simply a list of the liquor stores being robbed. So from 05 to 08, I worked with clients to help bring attention to those four things. And eventually the SEC eliminated the grandfather clause. We take it for granted now that we know the quantity of fails to deliver. We just take that as a given because we can go to the SEC website and get that. That was not the case until 2007. Prior to that, it was people like me, my friend Dave Patch, writing letters to the SEC, to FINRA for years, begging them for fails data. And they would make FOIA disclose, and this was FOIA requests. What we learned in that process is that the SEC does not own settlement data. That is owned by the Depository Trust Clearing Corporation, DTCC, which is an institution that is the sort of the child of the 1970s central clearing laws that were built into something called Reg National Market System, Reg NMS. We have to go into Reg NMS, but the DTCC is what we have today. And within DTC is this thing called, within DTCC is the National Securities Clearing Corporation, which manages CNS. You have DTC, the Depository Trust Company, which sort of holds all of our stock and trust through CD and Co. And that's a whole rabbit hole we don't have to go down.
Yeah, we've gone down at a bit, and the community has gone down a ton. But yeah, dude, for sure, this is helpful.
We didn't know. So the point is, these companies are on the threshold list, but you don't know what the fails are.
And the DTCC is a self-regulatory organization.
Exactly. So they're supposedly quasi part of the Federal Reserve System, but they are an SRO. So the SEC essentially gets the fails data from them, which we hope is accurate, right? We don't know. That's what they tell us is accurate. We have no idea. It's a black box. But that started in 07 that they started publishing this text file it used to be, it was either quarterly or monthly. Now we're lucky to have it every 2 weeks. You all enjoy it now. Back in the dark ages, you were waiting for that thing for a month or 2 months. It took a long time for that file to come out. So we had all these fails and we didn't know what they meant, but we just knew nothing was happening and companies would be in the threshold list for hundreds of days. The grandfather clause was eliminated. That didn't really make a difference. What really made a difference was in the fall, was in 2008. A whole bunch of bad stuff happened that finally brought attention to it.
Right.
And I have to tell this because it's so interesting. Gandhi had this phrase, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Yeah. And that was our progression with Reg SHO, because for years the regulators acted like this wasn't a problem. They would laugh at me in my face in meetings. I would have chief economists of the SEC laugh at me saying, naked short selling doesn't matter for prices, for market price. Efficient market hypothesis tells us naked short selling doesn't matter. Right. And
drastically increasing the supply of something can't possibly affect the price.
That incidentally, that same person wound up when he eventually left the SEC was an expert witness for the defense in a major naked short selling case, revolving door. But in 08, this is the punchline to the joke. And if your audience doesn't remember anything, remember this. You have to remember this. They had for years laughed at us and pretended like this wasn't a problem. It was corner cases. You're all crazy. You're mad that your stock price has gone down. These are crappy companies. Remember, this is Krispy Kreme, Netflix. It wasn't just,
Overstock was a big one of them, right?
Overstock, of course, was the big one. And I worked closely with the folks from Overstock for many of those years. In June of 08, all of a sudden, they started listening to us because people were concerned about serious market events. And the SEC and Chris Cox and the SEC all of a sudden banned naked short selling, i.e. they required a pre-borrow for short sales, not in every stock,
just in the bank,
but in the stocks of the 17 primary dealers, that is the banks that have access to the Fed that are buying treasuries, plus Fannie and Freddie. So it was 19 tickers, 17 primary dealers, plus Fannie and Freddie Mac. And that was it. And I remember sitting with a friend of mine in office, and we just couldn't believe it, because for years they pretended like we were the crazy ones. Yeah. Then all of a sudden they don't just agree with us; they agree to us to an absurd degree. They do exactly what we've been asking for, but only in the stocks of the companies that have been facilitating the naked short selling for all those years.
You can't write this shit, right? Like,
no, you can't. I mean, if you wrote that in the script, people would say, "Well, that's lazy writing." Yeah. You can't. That's lazy writing. But no, life is lazy writing. That'll be my tombstone. Life is lazy writing.
Jesus.
So, and then that was 08. They eventually did end the options market maker exception, largely because there were some very high profile cases, the Ehrenstein case, the Hazan case, Wolfson, Keystone, Options Express, where it was obvious that market makers, people were pretending to be options market makers, literally were sitting in their basement in their pajamas in New Jersey, pretending to be market makers. And the SEC actually talks about that in one of their rulings.
There's nothing wrong with sitting in your basement in your pajamas in New Jersey. Right?
Exactly right. Well, look at us now, right?
That's like, half my life. Now I'm up in Canada.
That just means you're doing it right.
Yeah.
They were essentially renting their exception for timely settlement. Yeah. And then they were doing, through trades called conversions, they were doing a couple things. One, all those companies on the threshold list are impossible to borrow.
Yeah.
But they're the stocks everybody wants to be short. Right. So how you get short?
A lot of money if you can lend those shares out. Ton of money.
That's right. And just for context, Overstock.com had a major lawsuit about this. If you read the California Court of Appeals ruling from 2014, which is now 10 years old, it goes into great detail about all of this. It's a very well drafted ruling. But if you're a market maker, you can essentially rent your exception and be a source of borrow for prime brokerage firms that are trying to get their clients short. So one of the things we noticed during this period was all these companies are on the threshold list for hundreds of days. But if you look at their 13Fs, the top long holders are the major prime banks. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's because those banks were the counterparties for the options market makers in these conversions and reversals. So the market maker would do what's called a conversion or reversal. They're essentially using an options position, transforming an options position into a stock position. Mm-hmm. The end result is that the prime broker, who's the counterparty, is long the stock, and the market maker is long, synthetic long through options, or they're delta neutral, as we say. Their book is flat. The prime broker gets long stock that they can then lend and overlend to their clients multiple times. We know that happens because there was a later lawsuit by a major hedge fund who figured out that their prime broker was ripping them off by lending them stock that they weren't even bothering to borrow. So the story of the threshold list is it's a list of liquor stores getting robbed, but it's also about how the participants, the market makers and the prime brokers colluded, if you will, to create to rob them even more, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
and to just create more sources of borrow than existed.
Right.
So the SEC this is Reg SHO is what they call Rule 203. They amended it and they added Rule 204 on top of that. Rule 204 they eliminated the options market maker exception.
But they still have the
tried
equity
to-
market maker exception.
They still have the equity market maker exception.
The Bernie Madoff exception.
The Madoff exception, I know, famously. The Rule 204 was temporary. They called it Rule 204T because it was temporary. And then 09, 010, they made it official. They shortened, they gave market makers until T plus 4.5 to cover their positions. And since then, I think you could fairly say that the threshold list is much quieter. However, it's not zero.
And we did have an example.
The first thing you notice,
the question we got of a stock, AMC, being on the threshold list last year for hundreds of days again.
Right. So one of the things that California Court of Appeals ruling talks about, which is interesting, is once a stock goes on the threshold list, there are rules. There are compliance departments at all these banks.
There are rules.
This isn't NOM, right? There are rules. That's funny. That's funny, man. We watched the same movies.
I got the poster in the back over here.
I have to tell a story about this. I actually went to a SIFMA conference once, like 12 years ago, and it was an actual panel discussion of operations, back office people discussing abuse they had received from the prime desk for requiring buy-ins of clients and buying in failed positions. And it was a whole panel. This was at like some hotel in Arizona talking about how operations people at these banks faced a lot of abuse when a failed position had to be bought in because they don't want people on the prime desk don't want their clients to be bought in. The question is, how does this still happen? Well, first of all, there are lots of ETFs on the list. I don't have a good answer to that. There are interesting theories as to why it is that the ETFs can remain on the threshold list forever. Like XRT, the S&P retail ETF
that's one of our questions is about
is
XRT.
on there. It's been on there since 2009. It's been on there for 15 years. And I've never gotten a good answer why. I haven't had, and no one's ever been able to give me a good answer why.
So 15 years.
It's been, as far as I can tell, plus or minus some periods off, XRT has basically been on for, call it 80% of 15 years. And I've never received a good answer why. I do believe, and I've had this told to me by people in the stock loan world, that you can use in stock lending if you have a stock that's hard to borrow, that's part of the basket of XRT, that there's a way to create a synthetic short position where you're kind of short the basket and long everything that isn't in the basket, or the opposite of that. I guess you're long the basket and short everything in the basket except that one stock. You essentially synthetically short that one thing that you can't short. And so you create.
So can you do that as a prime and then offer that as a locate?
I would think that's the question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
But to me, that seems like the most reasonable explanation of what's happening is you have some type of a synthetic desk, some Delta One desk at a bank that is engaged in these transactions that offers this as a source of locate. Because that locate requirement has never gone away. That's never been changed. Other things have changed in Reg SHO, but that never has.
But even if you have that as a locate, it's not like you can deliver that. It's not like you can actually borrow the underlying.
I want to add a caveat. There's an interesting thing to note here, just to think about for your viewers, because it's how we got here. As I said earlier, it matters. When the SEC finally stopped the options market makers from fraudulently renting their exception, one of the things that so you have opening positions, and then you have opening transactions, and then you have rolling transactions. So they would do this conversion and reversal to essentially call it opening the fail. That's when the fail begins. And I'll tell a story about that in a minute. And then you have the roll. So back then, T plus 13 was the time by which, now it's 4.5, but it used to be T plus 13. Even the market maker had to do something. And they would do a trade called a buy right. They would buy from a friendly counterparty, write a call, and essentially swap, and then fail on that. The net effect was they would swap out
that would reset
the fail. They would swap out an old one for a new one, reset the clock with the help from the executing broker in that process. And what is the strangest about all those cases? These market makers were, and that's how the stocks could stay on the threshold list for so long. Now, I bet your listeners are saying, well, wait a minute, is that happening now? Is that why these stocks are in the show?
That was a question we got.
Unfortunately, I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that. I've had clients that are companies that are in the threshold list. They don't understand why they've been on for these lengthy periods of time. I have a feeling it's related to some. Remember, who was the guy who Kathy Wood's friend, Bill Huang, who imploded? And he was working with. He was building these synthetic baskets of securities. I'm forgetting the name of what he was doing, but
the total return swaps.
The theory that I have heard is that there's something related to total return swaps in this process. That there's some element of that getting clients short economically without actually having sources of borrow, and that's happening in that sense. I wish I knew the answer. The SEC is much less helpful now than they were 15 years ago. It's odd. Like 15 years ago, we could at least get there and have conversations with them and get answers. Now you don't get a lot of answers from them. It's very hard.
The conversations with the SEC are usually
one way. And what's also interesting is like this generation left that was there for the creation of Reg SHO. Now you have a new generation. Yeah, I like that, 2008 and Reddit. There's a new generation that doesn't know this history, and frankly, they're just doing their time till they can go get to work for a law firm that represents industry. And they're just really unwilling to rock the boat. There's very little incentive to be courageous and take a stand and modify the rules in the way that needs to be done. And I think that we use this phrase gaslighting a lot. It's really unfair to have all this gaslighting when it's just obvious that Reg SHO isn't working even now. How can ETFs like XRT be on the threshold list forever? How can AMC go on, GameStop, others, right? It just, something isn't working and it's obvious. But what's funny is if you talk to them, they think that's the system working properly, because from their perspective, it's all about liquidity and not stopping the trading. You have to keep trading going. We have to value liquidity.
Why do FTDs exist at all in a dematerialized electronic market? And this is a question we got really consistently. Why is this even a thing still? Like, yes, with paper certificates, it made a lot of sense. How is this not like a straight through processing system at this point?
Yeah, so the great question. The system values two things. One is liquidity, so they don't want to ever stop the trading. They don't want anything to slow down execution of trades. Anything that's like looking for stock. That's you wouldn't. God forbid you actually look for stock that you sell. That would be wrong. Right. The other thing is that the system is designed. They're very nervous. And this isn't a defensive, this is kind of an is-ought question, as the philosophers would say. I'm describing the system as it is, not as I think it should be. But they're very worried about errors, fat finger, night trading kind of situations where you make an error that is so serious that you can't undo that. So I was around in the early days of blockchain and crypto, and people saying, hey, why don't we have blockchain settlement, instantaneous gross settlement? Yep. And I still hear that today. And it is an obvious use case. Sometimes I feel like blockchain is a solution looking for a problem in some ways, but that's an obvious use case.
Why don't you need a database? That's the first question I tell you.
But the answer to why we don't have instantaneous gross settlement on the blockchain is because regulators are worried about errors. And
Okay.
I would say that's the most generous defense of the system as it is today.
Okay.
If you could make a generous defense, is that they will say to you, well, it's a shitty system. Forgive me, it's a crappy system, but it's better than, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, it's a bad system, but it's better than the alternatives. So what we have is a bad system, but if you had instantaneous gross settlement, in theory, some hacker takes control of the system, does something awful, sinks an entire primary dealer in a day, and we can't have that. So the system is designed to allow for flexibility to help allow the clerks to fix stuff later on.
Okay. And to be fair, like, resilience of the system seems like a goal we should all share to a certain extent. Sense for, if you look at days where you have lots of FTDs, to what extent are those FTDs clerical errors versus essentially naked shorting?
Great question. And the answer is FTDs are the overwhelming majority of FTDs that I see, that I study, that I care about, are correlated with short selling and stock lending.
Okay.
So it is just not true for this assertion. And this has been, it's very easy to demonstrate if you have the data that this is true. So the answer that FTDs are clerical in nature, that they're short-lived, is just wrong. I mean, certainly that happens at the margin, but now in the data that I look at, FTDs are not spread. If that were true, they would be spread like butter across toast.
It'd be noise,
but it's not
all over, right?
They'd be noise, but it's lumpy. It's specific to certain issues at certain periods of time, and it is highly correlated with short selling. So no, I reject that assertion. The data reject that assertion. But the problem is when you take that to a regulator, you show that to them, they say, well, my wife's Korean. There's a great Korean phrase, "어떻게," which is like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
God.
And they don't have a good answer for it because they can't imagine a world. RegSHO is born of a world where it is to even think about penalize. I mean, the easiest thing you could do is penalize fails, aged fails. That's the easy thing you could do.
Right.
And we know that the regulators have the courage to do that because they've done that in the treasury market. If you remember, Dave, like, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, fails in the treasury market were a big problem.
Yep.
Well, the treasury came in and said, you know what, we're just going to start penalizing you for failing.
This isn't okay in U.S. debt.
Yeah. So that solved the problem pretty quick.
Yeah.
So they could do this. They could fix this tomorrow if they wanted to. But there just unfortunately, isn't the political will to do it.
So here's another question we got a lot of. Do you think that FTDs, a lot of people will point to them and say, look, it's mostly ETFs and it's, there's a pretty low amount on, most stocks. But do you think that they give that accurate picture, or are they underestimating the number of fails due to continuous netting?
Well, let me answer there are two pieces I want to answer there. The first is, just because that's true, that may be true, but that doesn't make it right.
Yeah.
Moreover, as has always been the case, manipulative short selling, short selling, I'm not here to bash short selling. And I teach finance.
Yeah.
It's an essential part of asset pricing,
needed,
right? But
sure.
But the point is to prevent. I used to work with someone who said a sea lion is not a lion. Naked short selling is like to short selling what a sea lion is to a lion.
Market manipulation.
Market manipulation. It happens in the corner cases where you have high growth small companies that are most vulnerable to price manipulation. That's where it happens. You might call it the land of the unsympathetic plaintiff, is where you have the most naked short selling and fraudulent, where it really matters for retail investors. Mm-hmm. And those are the places where you would want to have the most accountability, the most coherence in the system. Do you mind if I talk about the Dole Foods case? Because I think it's important.
Sure. Yeah.
Here's an interesting industry defense, which people should be aware of. And I remember I heard the word rehypothecation once from a journalist at the New York Post. And he said to me, Welborn, it's all rehypothecation. What are you talking about, man? It's all rehypothecation. Right. Who cares?
It's all turtles all the way down.
Turtles all the way down. Yeah, you know the person. Okay. So rehypothecation is this idea that, you basically lending the same stock over and over again. I'm what they call a beneficial owner. It's lent out of my account without my knowledge, because when I open a brokerage account, I sign this rehypothecation agreement. Yep. It's lent to customer B. By the way, I would never know that stock sold short unless a dividend was paid. And if the dividend is paid, I would only know that my shares have been lent because I would receive what's called a PIL, a payment in lieu. In that situation, I know I'm a dividend. I know my shares have been lent without my consent or knowledge. But rehypothecation is this idea that, you can have more beneficial owners than the float, than shares outstanding, right, through chained lending. Right. And in the GameStop aftermath, the SEC did write a report that I don't think it condones it, but attorneys for the sell side have said that the SEC report basically condones,
exonerates,
explains
it out away. Yeah, explain, right.
If you actually don't even need naked short selling to see that our system is broken. Right. You can just go look at the Dole Foods case in Delaware. Dole Foods was a public company. They were taken private. A bunch of beneficial owners showed up to the Delaware Chancery Court claiming to be owners, and there were more of them than shares outstanding. And the Delaware Chancery Court goes through this in detail. And that actually wasn't an example of naked short selling. That was just plain old rehypothecation, chain lending to an absurd degree. There were hundreds of thousands more beneficial owners than shares have been issued. And they were showing up. Actually, they were showing up to vote. That's what it was. They were showing up to vote. Right. This usually isn't an issue because most people don't vote their proxies.
They don't vote, or if they do, you have a company that sits in the middle of all this that can simply truncate votes and throw them away. And they do that.
There you are.
Millions and millions of votes every year just thrown away because it would come out to too many shares being voted.
And I have to tell you, I was at another SIFMA conference watching a panel about that, 15 years ago. And I was in a room full of lawyers all acting like I was totally normal. And I didn't know anything. I thought that I was shocked. I couldn't believe that the whole world thinks that's normal. Yeah. But everybody in the room thought that was, and they used to call it proportional voting, right? They would take whatever pot they got and they would just apportion that to actual shares outstanding and then call that the vote. Right. If 80% were pro, then they would just say, they would map 80% to the true number outstanding, not the actual number of votes that they got, and throw the rest of the votes out.
Yeah, it's totally crazy.
Right. So anyway, in the Dole Foods case, you look no further than Dole Foods to see that we need a reg. We don't just need Reg SHO Part 2.0. We need Reg NMS 2.0.
Yeah.
The whole architecture of the system needs to be reconsidered. It is the whole idea of central clearing, which is a great idea. Well, I should say it started off as a noble idea, has been so corrupted by these institutions whose interests are not aligned with either issuers or retail investors. Right. But the problem is Wall Street is unified, but issuers are not unified. The ones that care about it have the sympathetic plaintiff challenge, or they don't work together in coalitions well, and retail investors are not unified.
And isn't that the perfect illustration of the people that markets are supposed to work for and serve, investors and issuers, are disadvantaged because markets are run by intermediaries, regulated by intermediaries, and value intermediaries above anything else.
It is the definition, it is the purest example of capture that you will ever see. The intermediaries, first of all, they're the ones who propose the rules. They're the ones who propose the rule changes.
Exactly. Yep.
Then they essentially overwhelm, you'll get 100 comment letters, 5 are from SIFMA firms, and 95 are from retail investors. The SEC reads the 95, they laugh at them, they throw them out, they say, Jenny in Arkansas, what does she know about naked short selling? And they only cite the 5 that they get from the SIFMA clients, and then the rule gets drafted. I'll give you an example of this. In 2007, Goldman Sachs paid a huge fine at the time. It's not a big number, it's $2 million, but it was a big deal for facilitating naked short sales on behalf of clients.
Mm-hmm.
The next rule that was written was something called 10b-21, and they called it the naked short selling anti-fraud rule. Well, what that rule did was it attempted to shield brokers from liability from when their clients do something fraudulent that the broker may or may not have knowledge of, have scienter, right? So they call it the naked short selling anti-fraud rule, 10b-21. But the point of the rule was to defend brokers from what their clients were doing that the brokers may or may not have knowledge of.
So let me ask you, what impact do you think T+1 is going to have here? Is that a helpful step forward? What do you think it'll do to FTD, if anything?
Well, it's I think it's absolutely it is silly in this day and age that we don't have T+1 already.
Right.
Like we should have had it a long time ago.
Right.
Again, the defense has always been. I remember when going to T+2 was really controversial.
Mm-hmm.
So T+1 is a good thing, obviously. Nevertheless, I'm worried. What worries me is I have yet to, if you see companies like AMC, like GameStop, still on the threshold list for months at a time, it's obvious the system is broken.
Right.
And what I have always resented is this gaslighting from regulators, which I first encountered in 2006 and still experience today. This position they have that, those are fringe cases. Our job isn't to worry about those. We're worried about the 99% of other markets that do function well. When I would say the opposite is true, that shows that there's something rotten in the system. And I think it shows that Irv Pollock is still right. We're almost 40 years after Irv Pollock wrote his famous report, the Pollock Report, and he's still correct. The system as it is designed cannot prevent unlimited fails. So T+2 is a great thing, but it's not enough. It's not going to the architecture of how the system is managed. It's not going, we're still in a reasonable belief world, which is crazy. If we have the technology to go to T+1, we have the technology to at least require a hard locate, as we used to call it.
Yep.
Another issue that I'm sure your listeners may be aware of is there are these direct market access systems that allow essentially hedge funds to execute their own trades and provide their own locates in these DMA systems and document them themselves. The regulators know that those systems are a problem. Another panel I went to,
that's what I used to do, and like every day we would get a spreadsheet from the broker with our locates, and they're sending the same stuff out to however many, right? Like it was so ridiculous. I couldn't even believe it.
And the regulators know that. In fact, the joke, I was on this panel with these FINRA guys laughing how they would read these locate sheets and it would say Vinny or Tony or 3 dots in the locate section of the sheet. So the regulators know this. Yeah. But again, the rules are written as the rules are written.
So let me ask you this then, with the time we have left, a really simple 2-part question. What do you think about the idea of a settlement discipline regime? And to what extent do you think that global regulatory coordination is needed? Because even if we do fix problems here, is there a whack-a-mole issue with sort of, positions being shifted offshore, fails being shifted offshore? Right. How do we even begin to address this in the right way?
First of all, I'm not familiar with the first term that you used. That may be a new term.
Discipline regime, which that's basically what Europe has done, which is sort of what you're thinking, that mandatory buy-ins and fines as fails age.
Not only is that a good idea, that's the obvious. That it should be criminal that isn't obvious to everybody that that's what we need. I mean, the fact that that's a controversial proposal is interesting to me. It should tell you all that you need to know.
It should.
So yes, that's the obvious. They solved fails in the treasury market right away by introducing settlement discipline. They could solve fails overnight here if they wanted to. the ETF thing is the weirdest mystery ever, and people should need to press upon that because it's been happening since '08, and no one has a good explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
The second question, I want to actually answer your second question. I actually think, you grow up and you have this idealistic view of the United States, right? We're a beacon of freedom and liberty and strong institutions. We want those institutions to be exported to the world. Yeah. A lot of the history that I've been told by others is of American settlement regulators going to other countries and taking our regime there of net settlement, lax locates, lax pre-borrow, and essentially poisoning the well in other jurisdictions. So it's a double-edged sword. Yes, I hear the stories for years of shenanigans in Germany, trading on German exchanges. That's been going on for a long time. Mm-hmm. And the delay and what happens here, and the fact that FINRA, their jurisdiction does not extend to Germany and other offshore exchanges. Absolutely, right. There needs to be coordination. The problem is we have the fox guarding the hen house here. Yeah. So are you going to have two foxes coordinating with each other? I don't know. It's in China, they I remember very clearly when DTCC started going to China and helping the Chinese build their settlement system. It was an important moment about 10 years ago, and we're seeing the result of that today in mainland China.
Okay, so I know we're at time here, so I think this is absolutely going to need a part 2. This was a fascinating conversation, John. I really appreciate you joining us.
Right on.
And I think it'll generate a lot of questions, but maybe it'll also help to generate some passion for action, because this is an area that our advocacy efforts in We the Investors are focusing on this year, and pushing for these kinds of changes. And so I think hopefully what Wall Street fails to account for is that now individual investors are in the room and can be thoughtful about these issues and can bring the data, as you tend to, which is, I think something unique for where we're at. And especially when you look at historically how retail and individual investors have been treated in the regulatory processes as you're talking about.
Amen.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And we hope you enjoyed this conversation. We know that a lot of you care about these issues. We will get a part 2 on the calendar. So whatever questions this left you with, which I'm sure are plenty, let us know in the comments. Let us know on Urvin. And we're going to hopefully get John on Urvin to answer some questions directly there too. And that's at urvin.finance. So make sure, again, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, or on YouTube if you're watching us there. Leave some comments. Let us know what you think. Give us a good rating if you can. And we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.